The sun hung low over Makurdi town, spilling a golden glow over the dusty streets. Traders shouted prices of yam and pepper, motorbikes weaved through the crowd, and the smell of roasted corn filled the air. Yet, in the middle of this noise, sat a boy no one truly saw. His clothes were torn, his feet bare and cracked from walking the hot ground. In his trembling hands was a broken plastic bowl with only a few dirty coins clinking inside. His eyes, pale and cloudy, stared into a darkness he had known since birth. People passed him like he was invisible. Some threw coins without looking, others spat insults. He sat still, lips trembling with a soft whisper, "God, if you can hear me, prove it." No one paused to listen. To them, he was just another beggar, a child swallowed by poverty. But what they didn't know was that this boy, mocked and cursed by his own village, would one day return to these same streets in a car that made people's necks turn. His name would be spoken in places he once only heard in dreams. This is not just a story of riches, it is a story of pain, fire, and a destiny that refused to die. Paul was born in a small mud house by the banks of River Benue, in a village where whispers traveled faster than the wind. His father, Samson, was a tall man with a strong build, but blindness had been his shadow since childhood. His mother, Esther, shared the same fate. Her calm smile often hid the pain of a world she had never seen. Together, they worked with the little strength they had. Samson chopped firewood by sound and smell, while Esther sold vegetables and ground nuts, her fingers dancing gently over every coin. They were poor, but they carried themselves with quiet dignity. When Paul was born blind, neighbors shook their heads and whispered, "This family is cursed." Some avoided their house, claiming evil spirits lived there. But Paul's parents loved him deeply. They prayed over him every night, their hands trembling as they traced his tiny face, hoping God would open his eyes. Poverty, however, grew like a weed. Their roof leaked, their meals were small, and the weight of blindness pressed heavily on their shoulders. Paul grew up surrounded by darkness. Not just the darkness in his eyes, but the darkness of rejection. Children mocked him, calling him names. Adults pitied him but offered no help. Yet, even as a boy, he had a calmness about him, a strange strength that came from somewhere deep within. His parents often told him, "Paul, you may not see now, but God sees you." Those words were his only light in a world that seemed determined to swallow him whole. Paul's childhood was shaped by silence and whispers. Their small home stood at the edge of the village, its mud walls cracked, and its zinc roof groaning every time the rain fell. Nights were the hardest. The sound of raindrops hitting the leaking roof mixed with the groans of hunger from Paul's empty stomach. His parents would sit close to him, hands locked in prayer, whispering softly in voices that trembled with faith and fear. "Lord, let light find our boy." Esther would pray, her blind eyes wet with tears. Samson's rough hands would hold Paul's tiny fingers, guiding them to his face as if to assure him that love still existed in their darkness. But the world outside their home had no kindness for them. Villagers mocked Samson and Esther for being blind, calling them burdens. Some claimed their blindness was a punishment, and Paul's condition a curse passed down from them. Paul, even as a child, felt their judgment like stones thrown at his heart. He often heard other children laugh at him as he stumbled along the dusty paths, his cane tapping softly against the ground. He had never seen the faces of those who mocked him, but their words painted sharp pictures in his mind. Despite the ridicule, Paul's parents worked hard. Samson would rise at dawn, following the sound of birds to the forest where he chopped firewood. Esther's hands moved with grace, sorting vegetables and ground nuts at the village market, guided only by touch. Their blindness did not stop their effort, but their earnings could barely feed them. Paul learned early that life was a battle for survival, and his parents were warriors fighting with empty hands. Paul's own blindness, however, carried something deeper. At night, strange dreams haunted him. He would see flashes of a glowing woman with serpent-like eyes, her voice hissing his name from the shadows. "You will never see the light," she whispered. He would wake up trembling, his small body drenched in sweat. His parents prayed over him, but fear tightened its grip on their hearts. Even neighbors began to speak of spirits, saying that Paul's blindness was not natural. Still, Paul clung to hope, a quiet spark buried deep within him. He couldn't see the stars, but he would sit outside their hut at night, listening to the crickets and feeling the wind brush his face. In those moments, he whispered to God, believing somehow that the heavens could hear him. "If you can see me, please don't forget me," he often prayed. Those simple words became his shield, even when life around him grew colder. What Paul didn't know was that his story was already being written, and though darkness surrounded him, destiny was quietly stirring. The journey to Makurdi was not a choice, it was desperation. Hunger had worn Samson and Esther thin, their once strong bodies now frail from years of struggle. The village offered no mercy. Neighbors who once helped now turned away. "You are cursed," they whispered, avoiding their door. So, with trembling hands, Samson held his son's shoulder as they boarded an old, rusty bus. The smell of diesel filled the air, and Paul clutched his mother's wrapper, terrified by the chaos of horns and shouting conductors. He couldn't see, but he felt every bump, every whisper of pity. When they arrived in Makurdi, the noise was overwhelming. The city was alive but cold, a place where poverty screamed, but no one listened. Life in the city was harsher than in the village. Samson's blindness made finding work impossible, and Esther's vegetable business collapsed before it began. Days passed without food and the family grew weaker. One morning, a stranger placed a cracked plastic bowl in Paul's hand and said, "Sit there. People will pity you." That was how Paul became a child beggar. At just 10 years old, he sat by a busy roundabout, the roar of okadas and buses drowning his small voice. Some threw coins without looking, others muttered insults, and many simply passed as though he didn't exist. But the streets were not just unkind, they were dangerous. Older boys bullied him, stealing whatever coins he managed to collect. He came home bruised, his parents weeping helplessly. "We failed you," Esther cried one night, hugging him tightly. Paul said nothing. Even at his age, he understood they were prisoners of their own blindness, shackled by poverty and fate. Every day, he returned to that roundabout, his small hands stretched out, hoping someone would see him, not just see his blindness, but his pain. Paul began to hum songs as he sat. His voice was soft but filled with sorrow, carrying a weight that made strangers pause for a moment. Some dropped extra coins, others simply stared at him with pity. Singing became his escape from the shame of begging. But even this small light attracted cruelty. A man approached him one day, promising food and shelter, but instead used Paul as cheap labor, forcing him to carry loads at the market. Paul's body bore the marks of beatings, yet he never told his parents, not wanting to add to their pain. Night after night, Paul curled on a thin mat beside his parents, his body aching, his heart heavy. The darkness in his eyes now felt like the darkness in his life, a deep, suffocating pit. He whispered prayers into the night, his voice cracking, "God, if you see me, save me." No answer came, only the sound of crickets and the faint crying of his parents in the dark. But destiny was already moving, slowly, silently, like a seed buried deep in the soil, waiting for its time to break through. Paul's nightmares grew darker with each passing night. At first it was only shadows, whispers in the dark that chilled his bones, but soon the visions became vivid. In his dreams he stood at the edge of River Benue, the moon glowing blood red, casting strange ripples on the water. A woman emerged from the river, her skin shimmering like polished bronze, her eyes glowing like hot coals, her voice slithered like a snake. "Paul, you will never see the light. You belong to me." He woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, his trembling fingers clutching his chest. Samson and Esther would rush to his side, blind hands feeling his face, whispering prayers through tears. "God, deliver our son," Esther sobbed, rocking him like a baby. The villagers whispered of witchcraft, saying an evil spirit had claimed him. Paul felt it too. The nights became heavy with dread, and even in the day, he sensed something watching him. His voice, once his comfort, now carried a strange sorrow that made people uneasy. Some avoided him, whispering, "This boy carries something dark." The weight of poverty and fear pressed harder, yet in Paul's heart, a flicker of hope refused to die. One afternoon, while Paul sat humming softly by the roadside, a kind woman selling oranges stopped in front of him. She listened to his voice and felt a pull in her spirit. "My son," she said gently, "you need help that no coin can give. There is a pastor, a man of God. He prays for children like you." She gave them directions to a small church, her voice trembling as she added, Go. God is waiting for you there." That evening, Samson and Esther sat in their small room, faces turned toward heaven though they could not see the stars. They whispered about the woman's words. Samson's voice cracked. "Esther, maybe this is the answer we have prayed for." Esther nodded through tears. "If God can heal our son, I will walk barefoot to his house." The decision was made. They would go to this pastor, even if it meant their last bit of strength. The following Sunday morning, Paul held his mother's wrapper as they made their way through the crowded streets. The journey was long, filled with curious stares and whispers. Finally, they reached a small church with a rusted zinc roof and wooden benches. Inside, voices of prayer filled the air like thunder. Paul felt something shift the moment he stepped in, a presence, warm yet powerful, that made his heart race. This was no ordinary place. His story was about to change forever. The church was alive with prayer, voices rising like waves crashing against unseen walls. People clapped, sang, and cried out to God, filling the small room with an intensity Paul had never felt before. He clung to his mother's wrapper, trembling. Samson and Esther knelt on the dusty floor, blind eyes lifted toward heaven, tears streaming freely. Suddenly, a man's voice broke through the noise. "Bring that boy forward," Pastor Jack said firmly. His voice carried authority, yet it was full of compassion. A hush fell over the church as Paul was led to the front. Pastor Jack knelt, placing his hand gently on Paul's head. "What's your name, son?" he asked softly. "Paul," came the timid reply. The pastor closed his eyes and began to pray, his voice steady but commanding. Almost immediately, Paul felt a burning heat flood through his body, and he began to shake violently. A piercing scream erupted from his lips, startling the congregation. Esther clutched Samson's hand, weeping uncontrollably. "Pray," Pastor Jack shouted, and the entire church roared in tongues, their voices filling every corner like thunder rolling through the heavens. Paul collapsed to the floor, writhing as if bound by invisible chains. Suddenly, his own voice changed, deep and menacing. "He belongs to us. Leave him." Gasps filled the church as Pastor Jack rebuked the spirit with holy fire. "In the name of Jesus, release him." Sweat ran down the pastor's face as he prayed, his voice unyielding. The battle raged for hours, the air thick with spiritual tension. People wept and shouted prayers, mothers lifted their children, and men knelt in awe as Paul's small body shook with every word spoken over him. Then, it happened. With one final scream, Paul's body went still. Silence swept through the church, broken only by Esther's sobbing. Pastor Jack laid his hand over Paul's closed eyes and whispered, "Lord, open his eyes." Slowly, Paul blinked, and for the first time in his life, light flooded his vision. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he reached out, trembling. He saw his mother's face, worn yet beautiful, her eyes cloudy but full of love. He saw his father's strong frame, bent with struggle but radiating hope. "Mama, Papa, I can see you," Paul whispered, his voice shaking. The church erupted in cries of praise. People shouted, danced, and fell to their knees, glorifying God. Samson and Esther clung to their son, sobbing uncontrollably. Pastor Jack knelt beside Paul, his own eyes wet with tears. "This is what the Lord does. Darkness cannot hold what God has chosen." Word spread quickly across Makurdi. People flocked to see the boy who had lived in darkness, but now walked in the light. Paul's life, once ignored, was now a living testimony. The miracle had begun, and destiny's door had been flung wide open. Paul's healing became the talk of the entire town. Crowds gathered daily outside their small home just to see the boy who had once stumbled in darkness, but could now describe the color of the sky. Neighbors who once whispered curses now came with gifts, kneeling in awe of what God had done. Journalists came to take pictures. Pastors invited him to sing in their churches, and strangers pressed money into his hands, saying, "Your story has given us hope." For the first time, Paul felt seen, not as a beggar, not as a curse, but as a miracle. Music became his new language. His songs carried the weight of his pain, the beauty of his deliverance, and the faith that had carried him through suffering. Radio stations played his music, and invitations flooded in from cities far beyond Makurdi. A philanthropist offered to sponsor him, and soon Paul was recording albums, performing on grand stages, and inspiring millions. Yet fame did not change his heart. He remembered the days of hunger, the humiliation of begging, and his parents' silent tears. He used his earnings to buy a house for Samson and Esther, building them a safe home filled with laughter and light. Paul's success became a lifeline for others. He started a foundation for children with disabilities, creating opportunities that he never had. Beggars from the streets found jobs through him. Blind children were enrolled in school. His parents, though still blind, stood tall with pride, often telling visitors, "We cannot see him with our eyes, but we see him with our hearts." Paul became more than a singer. He became a symbol of hope, a reminder that God's light shines brightest in the darkest places. One sunny afternoon, Paul returned to the roundabout where he once sat with an empty bowl. He stepped out of a black SUV dressed in a white caftan, his presence commanding attention. Street hawkers paused, mouths open in shock. Paul knelt where he had once begged and prayed silently, tears streaming down his face. Then he handed out envelopes filled with money, hugging each beggar and telling them, "Never give up. Your story is not over." The crowd cheered, and some wept openly, touched by his humility. Paul's story spread across Nigeria, becoming a legend told in villages and cities alike. Yet he never boasted of his wealth. He always said, "I was blind, but God gave me sight. I was forgotten, but he remembered me." His journey was proof that no curse is stronger than God's plan, and no darkness can swallow a destiny marked by heaven. The boy who once prayed in whispers now sang before kings, but his heart remained at that dusty roundabout, forever connected to the pain that shaped him into a beacon of hope. Paul's story is more than a tale of rags to riches. It is a living testimony that no darkness is permanent, and no curse is too strong for God's light. He was born into poverty, mocked, beaten, and forgotten by a world too busy to see him. Yet the same streets that once spat on him became the roads that carried his success. The same hands that trembled with fear now lifted others out of despair. Life had stripped him bare, but faith clothed him with destiny. His journey teaches us that miracles often begin in the lowest places, and true greatness is forged through pain. Paul did not just rise to wealth. He became a beacon for every child sitting in dust, every parent weeping in silence, every soul that feels unseen. His story whispers to the hopeless, "Your current chapter is not the end. God sees you." If Paul's story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. Share this video with someone who needs hope today. Comment below and tell us, what miracle are you still praying for? Subscribe for more African folktales and true stories that prove even in the darkest nights, light can still break through.